Our students will bring around the cordless mics when it's question and answer period for those of you who have not been here before. I would like to then just tell you a little bit about who our panelists will be this evening. You have it in your program, but I'm going to start with Paul Schumaker. Paul Schumaker received his BA degree with majors in philosophy and economics from Beloit College. He has been a professor of political science at the University of Kansas since 1972. And during that time, he has served 5 terms as chair of the department. His interest in pluralist theory and public philosophy has evolved over these years. He has first sought to understand whether racial minorities and other relatively powerless groups could gain access in favorable policy responses when they engaged in protest activities targeted at urban officials. That work, published in such places as the Journal of Politics and the Sociological Quarterly, suggested the effectiveness of working within rather than against pluralist institutions. In the aftermath of the 2000 Gore-Bush election, he organized a panel of 36 political scientists to engage in a dialogue about the effectiveness of the current method used to elect perhaps the most powerful actor in the contemporary world politics, and that is the American president. Currently, Paul is working on 2 book-length projects. As a sequel to the current text, he is attempting to provide a comprehensive, progressive, pluralist public philosophy that synthesizes the ideas and beliefs of several left-of-center friends of pluralism and defends this perspective as superior to the right-of-center perspective, global neoliberalism, and currently is the governing ideology in much of the world. For Rick Levy, he is a J.B. Smith Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Kansas School of Law. He joined the KU Law faculty in 1985, having received his law degree from the University of Chicago Law School, and having served as a clerk for Judge Richard Posner in the U.S. Court of Appeals, the Seventh Circuit. He has been active in law reform committees and involved in rewriting the state's Child in Need of Care Code and reviewing changes to the Kansas Administrative Procedure Act, as well as offering expert testimony to legislative committees on issues ranging from flag burning through reorganization of the Board of Agriculture to campaign financing reform. Professor Levy is fluent in German and has studied in Germany and served as an exchange professor at the University of Vienna. Jonathan Earle, who I work with every day and is really my pleasure, grew up in suburban Washington, D.C., and was educated at Columbia University and Princeton University. He is currently working on a book on the election of the 1860 for Oxford University Press. Earle also serves as the Associate Director for Programming for the Dole Institute of Politics. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including Jacksonian Anti-Slavery and the Politics of the Free Soil. Jonathan also is a mastermind to get different programs and try to make them exciting, as many of you know because you have heard him do that before. So as I told you, it is a real pleasure this evening. When we're talking about the Electoral College, some people will say, just abolish the thing, get rid of it. Let our vote count. I see people shaking their head. Well, it's not quite that simple. So when we were putting together our programs this evening, we tried to think not only of POTUS 44, electing the President of the United States, but what kind of programs would all interact with each other so that you would get a better idea of your vote. Does it count? Does it not? If we keep the Electoral College, why? Why isn't it just easy to get rid of it? This panel of experts will tell you this evening all the ins and the outs, and if they didn't answer anything or all the things you had in mind, you will have your opportunity to ask very civil questions, and they will entertain answering them. Start, please.
I'll start. Thank you, Barbara. We're going to, I guess, start in reverse order. Let me just say at the outset that this Constitution Day that we're celebrating, that Barbara's been working on for a long time, it's one of those famous unfunded congressional mandates. In other words, every university that takes federal funds has to mark Constitution Day on September 17th. What I'm very proud of, and I'm proud of Barbara and I'm proud of my colleagues on this panel, is that instead of just reading the preamble like so many campuses are doing, we're actually trying to make it substantive and have a discussion. So I think that's a really good thing. Let me get started. True or false for you in the audience? In 48 days after what has been the longest and most expensive campaign in U.S. history, each of us will go into a voting booth and, at long last, cast our votes for President and Vice President of the United States. You guys are smart. The answer is false. You're correct. What we'll really be doing on November 4th is voting for a slate of electors, just like residents of the 49 other states in the District of Columbia. So even though our ballots will list the names of the presidential candidates, we're really choosing people who will, in turn, cast electoral votes on our behalf for the two offices. The bottom line, despite all the national popular vote totals we'll see not Peter Jennings, we'll see on CNN, we'll see on Charlie Gibson, and at the courthouse if we go down and see it kicked old school, these popular votes are not the basis for electing president or vice president. In fact, popular votes are irrelevant. Indirect elections like ours are common in some emerging democracies, like in the Philippines or in South Korea. But in these and most other nations with republican forms of government, this system has been dismantled in favor of direct elections. The United States is, as far as I could tell from my research, alone in having a process of indirect presidential election that has persisted for more than 200 years. So why can't we just elect the women and men that we want and dispense with this entire indirect and, frankly, anti-democratic system, like the rest of the democratized world? Easy answer, actually, for that one. It's because it's in the Constitution. The next question, and I think the reason why I was asked to be on this panel, in addition to the fact that I work down the hall, is why is it in the Constitution in the first place? And to answer this question, it helps to know a little bit about 18th century history and politics. First of all, the 18th century, where our nation was born, was a time of great deference. People deferred to their social betters in a way that would probably offend us today. Women deferred to men, slaves deferred to masters, younger men deferred to older men, and all deferred to people with an elite station in life. In addition to that, the federal system outlined in our Constitution, which we are celebrating today, is not the first government that we had after achieving independence from Great Britain, because for a very tumultuous decade, between 1781 and 1787, the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation, which were a democratic but rather messy and inefficient coalition of 13 separate republics that were equal in our big national Congress. It was extremely hard during the time of the Articles for the central government, which, again, consisted of a unicameral Congress, to do things that we expect government to do, like levy taxes, like provide for the common defense, which is in the preamble, like make foreign policy. Imagine all the states having an equal say in how foreign policy is made, whether we're going to withdraw from Iraq, whether we're going to help Georgia in their situation with Russia. So some of our leading founding fathers, men like George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, decided to scrap the Articles and implement a new federal system. This was easier said than done, not least because built into the Articles of Confederation was a mandate that you couldn't amend them without a unanimous 13-vote decision. So it's really hard to get this done. But these critics of the Articles, who came to be known as Federalists, pulled it off. Their method was quite brilliant, and I want you to think about this. They called separate conventions of the people in each state to send delegates to a special constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787, unleashing the best publicists and propagandists of the time to defend the new document. We know them today as the Federalist Papers, written by Jay, Hamilton, and Madison. And then to declare the new Constitution ratified when just 9 states, 3/4 of the states, decided that they wanted a new system of government. So even though we celebrate Constitution Day on September 17th, the day the Philadelphia Convention voted on and passed the document, it really didn't go into effect until a timetable set in motion after the 9th state, New Hampshire, passed the Constitution in July of 1788. You could view, and I think I might, this as essentially a coup d'etat by the Federalist camp. But the Articles were such a mess and so lame that eventually all 13 states voted to adopt the Constitution. The alternative, if you're a state like Rhode Island, would be to be the People's Republic of Rhode Island and surrounded by other states in the United States, and they decided not to do that. Let me give this to our founders. They were, for the most part, visionaries, and their Constitution has endured to govern us and inspire others for more than 2 centuries. But despite what strict constructionists, like Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court, argue, it's not because the original document was perfect or should be interpreted only with our founding fathers' original intent in mind. It's because the Constitution has evolved over the years because we, as Americans, have changed it. Not willy-nilly, but when the document no longer suits our needs as a people. Southern states get a bonus in federal representation because of the infamous 3/5 clause. Scrap it. Slavery is finally, at long last, determined to be an unmitigated evil. Pass the 13th Amendment to abolish it. Corrupt state legislatures choose U.S. senators and not the people of each state. Pass an amendment for the direct election of that office. Black men and all women can't vote. Same thing. We can change our Constitution. But one of the original flaws that remains in our federal compact is the Electoral College. So, why did a majority of the members of the Constitutional Convention leave the election of president to the Electoral College and not the people? The way I like to teach my students about the Constitution is that it is a big, unwieldy, but useful compromise. It's a compromise between North and South, between big states and small states, between people urging more democracy and those working hard to tamp down the spirit of the revolution. Remember, each state had to be convinced to scrap the old articles and sign on to the new federal plan. There were bound to be winners and losers, but back to the Electoral College, a grand compromise if there ever was one, small states fought hard for it because it gives them an extra bonus, extra power in selecting our chief executive. Think about it. Since the electoral votes of each state equal the number of congressmen and senators from that state, small states have a much greater percentage of the electoral vote than larger states. The math I did today, and I'm not that good at math, is that Wyoming, our smallest state in terms of population, one electoral vote for Wyoming equals 167,081 persons. In California, the most populous state, it's one electoral vote for 645,172 persons. It's a difference of 5 to 1. So much for the court's vaunted one man, one vote doctrine. The second reason is the one that's harder for me to stomach, and I imagine will cause a lot of questions from you guys. Many of our founders, even the ones we most venerate, were terrified of direct elections. They didn't trust ordinary voters to make the right choice, and they were especially afraid that what we now call, euphemistically, low information voters, I don't know, dumb people, ignorant people, would elect a demagogue, or that a future tyrant could manipulate public opinion, come to power legally, and then destroy the republic from within. As Alexander Hamilton, who, by the way, wanted senators and presidents to serve life terms. George Bush is looking pretty healthy to me. You could go on. The only way you could get rid of a president, according to Hamilton's plan, was for violating a code of bad behavior. Hamilton wrote in Federalist Number 68, the only quote I'll read tonight, "The immediate election, the real election, should be made by the men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station, and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation, and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. A small number of persons, selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass, will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite for such a complicated investigation." Sounds great, but I think that's what we would all call very elitist. So Hamilton and many of the other founders believed that these rarefied electors, men of property, education, and standing, would alone be able to ensure that a qualified person became president. Also that parochial people in one state wouldn't just vote for a candidate because he was their neighbor, or that they knew him personally, or because he lied better than the other guy during the campaign. Perhaps these things were true in the 18th century, but let's be honest, today's electors are not the men of information and discernment envisioned by Hamilton. They're mostly, and I apologize to those of you who are actually electors, party hacks and big-time donors. Really, do you think you were chosen for your wisdom, education, and breeding? Probably not. Electors' names only appear on the ballot, as far as I could tell, on 8 of our 51 state and District of Columbia ballots. So they're not even there. You think you're voting for John McCain, you're actually voting for a slate of electors. Furthermore, electors don't do anything more than act, as one scholar has held, as marionettes in a Punch and Judy show. And when they don't, when they bolt and become faithless electors, like 8 have done over the past 65 years, they're substituting their own judgment for the voters. If this bothers you, and you want to pass laws binding electors to the people's will, well, these statutes may well be unenforceable and may be unconstitutional as well. We'll talk about that tonight. Let me finish up. Some constitutional conventioneers at the time did fight hard for a more direct election of president. But the Federalists, led by Hamilton and Madison, prevailed. Again, they had the best publicists, the best organization, and the failures of the Articles of Confederation on their side. Almost immediately, however, the electoral system set out in the Constitution ran into serious trouble. Between 1788 and 1796, factions emerged that began to look a lot like today's political parties. And since Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 of the Constitution stipulated that each elector voted for two persons for president, rather than one for president, one for vice president, with the winner taking the top prize and the runner-up getting to go to a lot of funerals, we had the awkward situation of John Adams, a staunch Federalist, winning the presidency while his chief political opponent, Thomas Jefferson, served as his vice president. 4 years later, there was another crisis when Jefferson and his choice for vice president, a guy named Aaron Burr, tied in the Electoral College. Because so many Federalists detested Jefferson, there was an attempt to make Burr president, even though everybody knew that he was really running for vice president. Luckily, a compromise was reached before Jefferson was literally robbed of the presidency he rightfully won. And the 12th Amendment to the Constitution spared us ever having this problem again. See, it is possible to tinker with our founding document. In closing, the continued existence of the Electoral College makes it possible, even probable, that once again the choice of the people will be thwarted by this 200-year-old Rube Goldberg contraption. 3 times in our history, 1876, 1888, and 2000, the winner of the popular vote lost in the Electoral College. One other time, in 1824, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives, and the guy who won actually lost. What's more, the winner-take-all system in place in 48 of our states disfranchises millions of voters and actually depresses turnout. What, after all, is our incentive to vote for Obama here in Kansas or for a Californian to vote for McCain? Any chance we'll even see a presidential candidate in our state this time around? Unlikely. Finally, there's even worse electoral stipulation in the Constitution than the Electoral College, that thing that happened in 1824. With shifts of just a few thousand votes, the elections of 1884, 1916, 1948, 1960, and 1976 would have been thrown into the House of Representatives, an institution that has a favorability rating of 14%. Can you imagine what it would look like if, like in 1824, Congress got to choose our chief executive this time around? No matter which party's in charge, I'm pretty sure I don't want the choice of president to look anything like slapping together a farm bill or funding infrastructure projects in Ketchikan, Alaska. Talk about a bridge to nowhere. I will leave that to Rick.
Actually, Paul's next.
Okay.
Oh, well, I can't beat that. Can anybody see anything over top of you? Good. I'm the guy with the technological difficulties. I was going to show you some Electoral College maps, but then we discovered that we don't have the right internet connection cable for my computer. And so I've got my little notes on my computer. I just want to make sure you weren't seeing them. I actually expected a lot smaller crowd. The Electoral College, to me, is simply an academic question. Whether or not we continue to have the Electoral College will not, isn't in play before now and November. And even if we were to decide that the Electoral College is as bad as John describes it, it's very unlikely that we are going to see any changes in this institution for reasons I think Richard will describe. I suspect that the constitutional hurdles are immense. So for me, the Electoral College is interesting because it provides me with 2 very big puzzles. The first is, why is my discipline? I'm a political scientist. Why is political science unable to give any prescription to the American public, American government, about what is the best way to elect the most powerful person in the world? The reality is American political scientists are very divided on this issue, do not have a good consensus about it, and it just seems to me that it's kind of a sad state of affairs for academic discipline not be able to give advice on such a central and fundamental question. The second puzzle is why are American people willing to be effectively marginalized as they were in 2000? Why is it when Gore won by about 500,000 votes, that outcome was basically disregarded, and a outcome in the Electoral College in which Bush won 271 to the 266 that Gore received? Notice that didn't quite up to Barbara's 538. We're one short. We'll talk about that. It was one of those rogues that John mentioned. In any event, why would American people accept that? Why after the election? I thought right after the election there would be an uproar. But the reality was that we all got, I guess, our attention got elsewhere. We got focused on such things as hanging chads in Florida. We got focused on the various shenanigans that the Florida legislature and Secretary of State, I believe was her office, and other people were engaged in, with what the Supreme Court decided in Bush versus Gore, and et cetera. And the fundamental issue underlying all of those other surface issues that consumed our attention got forgotten. Right after the election, I got a bunch of calls. I was chair of the department at that time. I got a lot of calls from the press saying, right after, within a few days, they were talking about the Electoral College still then. And I really didn't know. I went off searching the literature to try to understand what political scientists thought about this, and I was baffled by the fact that there was no consensus in the literature, that we couldn't even agree on the standards by which to think about whether or not the Electoral College was good or bad, or whether any alternative to it was better. So I decided to organize a group of 36 political scientists to see if perhaps there wasn't more consensus than the literature suggested. Maybe the people that were political scientists were writing this stuff were just a bunch of ideologues, and so I started with Bird Loomis, who was my good friend and was at that moment director of something called the Dole Institute. And I realized we would need some money to do this and have a conference and stuff. So, and Bird was really hooked into a lot of the people in the discipline that I thought would contribute effectively to this relatively objective or dispassionate attempt to evaluate it. And so we did gather 36 political scientists together. And we assigned them to different areas that we thought would be impacted by the kind of system we had, whether we had the Electoral College or replaced it with various alternatives, and see what its impact would be on such things as how campaigns were managed and the strategies they adopt, how it affected citizen participation, how it affected the party and the interest group system, how it affected how Congress and the presidency worked together to try to overcome some of the issues of the separation of powers so they could effectively govern, and the various such areas. And people in these different areas got together. They sort of looked at all the research and theory that existed in these areas, came to as much consensus as they could about the primary findings and propositions that they felt confident about. They wrote papers about all these, their findings, and then we disseminated all these papers, had a conference, and we voted. And who do you think won? What do you think won? Well, first of all, let me tell you what our alternatives were. We looked at the Electoral College, and then we thought, well, okay, what are the alternatives? Well, most of the time we think of the alternative is what John suggested, the popular plurality. We're all familiar with popular plurality elections. We just all vote, and the one with the most votes wins. But it's not clear that that is the only alternative. Many systems have what's called a popular majority system. And that is if no candidate gets a majority, then you have to have a runoff, or some threshold. If it's not a majority, 40% or something like that. We talked about 50% given the importance of majority rule in democratic theory. We talked about different reforms of the system that weren't necessarily popular, like having a district plan, which is a plan that many people in Kansas think would be a good thing because it would allow us folks in this district where the Democrats are not totally overwhelmed by Republicans to have a chance of at least getting one electoral vote for the Democratic candidate. Essentially, the district plan, instead of giving all of the votes of the state to the popular winner in the state, gives one vote to the person who won the most votes in a district. And so in Kansas, we'd have four people who would, four districts up for grabs, and then we'd have two electors that would go to the candidate getting the most in the state. Nebraska and Maine have that plan, and it hasn't made any difference in reality over the 40 years or so that they've had that plan. There's proportional representation. We could think about, well, if Obama gets only 33% of the vote in Kansas, by proportional representation, he'd still get 2 electoral votes. 4 would go to McCain if he got 67%, etc. It would be that way through all the states. It's a reasonable option that is very popular in places like Europe. We also looked at certain kinds of, we talked about one plan that was a way of trying to achieve the results of a popular plurality with still maintaining the fundamental electoral or constitutional elements of the Electoral College, and that's called the bonus plan, the National Bonus Plan. It's championed most prominently by historian Arthur Schlesinger. And the plan basically says, in addition to allocating the 530 votes as Barbara described it, we'd have another 102 electors that would go to the candidate who won the most votes in the nation. And if you think about that, having a bonus of 102 would ensure that any person who won the popular vote would be the president. There is, as Richard's going to talk about, another plan going around which is trying to do the same thing, a national compact that was invented about the same time we were putting out our book, and so we didn't get to discuss it. But I view it as simply anything I've got to say about the effectiveness of a popular plurality would pertain to the national compact as it would achieve the same result. Given those alternatives, how did we vote? Well, we tried all the different voting methods to figure out which would be the right. And we got different results by different methods, which is just exactly what the problem is, that there is no one best method, that each method has strengths and weaknesses. Different methods provide different results. And if you don't know what I mean by that, just go back to the 2000 election. Remember that if we had had a popular plurality election, Gore would have won. If we had had a popular majority election, Gore might have won if, let's say, the Nader votes went to Gore, but that might not have happened. Under that system, it's possible anything else could have happened. We don't know. So the rules make all the difference. But by our results, the system we have was the most approved system. And but however, it was only the first choice of 40% of the people participating. We split our votes among all the alternatives, which it turns out to be a very fundamental issue in trying to orchestrate any kind of fundamental reform. Because the fact is we can't agree that the popular plurality is the best, I was asked in our dinner what I preferred. I prefer something called the instant runoff. And I'm sure some of you out there would just soon be delighted with the district plan, and some of you would like proportional representation. We could have that debate, and hopefully it would be a civil one if we get there this evening. Why is it that we supported the Electoral College? Well, in the aftermath of that whole project, what I tried to do was figure out what are the criteria that we kept coming back to in trying to make up our minds. And if I looked at at 9 or 10 major criteria, you would look at them that the Electoral College system actually does worse than the popular plurality system on most criteria. One good criteria, for example, is simplicity. Don't we want a system that all citizens can understand? How many people, now you probably understand the Electoral College somewhat, but most people don't know what the Electoral College is, how it works, and so it's a complexity which is far greater than simply having a popular plurality system, which we're all familiar with. Another criteria would be equality. Every person counts equally. John went through the math. We don't count equally under the Electoral College system. We would under a popular plurality system. Another criteria we would ask is there any built-in bias in the system? And in our discussions, we talked about, there are some very significant biases in the Electoral College system. There are biases towards small states. There are biases in favor of states that are swing states. If you are in Ohio, if you are in Michigan, you're getting a lot of visits from the candidates. You're getting a lot of promises from the candidates to do things that will benefit people in your state. We aren't getting any of that in Kansas. So there are systematic disincentives for candidates to target certain people and incentives for them to target other people that exist in the Electoral College that do not exist in the more direct system. There is interesting in the political science literature a theory that one group that's advantaged by the Electoral College system are racial minorities. That theory is based on the idea that these large competitive states are places where minorities are disproportionately located, and therefore candidates target such people. We had a long conversation about that, and we find very little evidence that that is in fact the case. That since that truism was thrown out there, minorities have become much more widely dispersed in American society, and more importantly, candidates have found ways of sort of not targeting minorities or taking minorities for granted in ways that have diminished any advantage that they had in the Electoral College system. I could go on. Oh, I guess another one I'd want to mention is the importance of being what's called a sincere versus a sophisticated voter. A sincere voter is you're able to identify the candidate who really represents your principles and your interests. And you have no disincentive for voting for that candidate. So if my real choice in the 2000 election was, I just say hypothetically because he wasn't, Ralph Nader, if he was the guy whose principles and interests I represented, I should vote for him because he's my real sincere choice. But I wouldn't have, especially if I voted in Missouri or someplace other than Kansas where my vote made a difference. I would not want to waste my vote on a candidate I knew wouldn't want to win. I would want to vote for my second favorite candidate because I don't want my third favorite candidate, my least favorite candidate, to win. Okay? That's called being a sophisticated voter. But democratic theory says we should be sincere voters. We should, really, all elections are about being, having a chance to articulate, find that candidate that represents us and vote for that person. But in the Electoral College system, because it basically makes it impossible, very difficult, I'm not saying impossible, difficult for third-party candidates to win, if your sincere choice is a third party, you're not inclined to be a sincere voter and waste your vote. I could go on with some more of these criteria, and all of them weigh against the Electoral College. So what is it that weighs for the Electoral College? Why did my colleagues choose to endorse that first and foremost? And the answer basically comes down to two things. Legitimacy. There is the belief that the Electoral College system is more likely to, whatever the result is, whether it is the most popular candidate or not, in terms of the popular vote, people will accept it. In fact, the Electoral College turns very narrow victories into rather large victories. You can see that, for example, in the 1968 election, where Nixon just barely beat Humphrey in the popular vote, but had a significant victory in the Electoral College vote. You can see that over and over in history, that there's a tendency for that to happen. And so people think it's a pretty, the guy won by quite a bit, so he must be the legitimate winner. And more importantly, even in elections like 2000, where the popular candidate lost, people believe that whoever wins under the existing rules, which in this case is the Electoral College, he's the legitimate winner. We don't go, to the barricades to try to overturn a result of the Electoral College. We have had stability. The only election in American history which had resulted in fundamental instability was 1860, when the election of Lincoln, which had nothing to do with the Electoral College but had to do with other things, resulted in the Civil War. So that was the first consideration. The other is what I think John also alluded to, and that's the idea of unanticipated consequences. Because we don't know, we all have memories as political scientists of 1968, when the McGovern Commission made fundamental rule changes in the Democratic Party that had consequences far different than the reformers imagined. And whenever we get kind of conservative in our thinking, we think that any kind of reform may not quite work out as we imagine them, that the consequences may be far worse than we imagine. So there is this sort of, if you will, bias towards the status quo that comes out of that. I think implicit in both of those is also the argument, that the Constitution did create the Electoral College. That is sort of a prior contract that we made with each other 220 some years ago, and we can't renege on those agreements without having a really strong supermajority in favor of change. And the Constitution has put a lot of requirements for supermajoritarianism in place to protect the original agreement. So in conclusion, that's the reason the Electoral College is still prominent in the profession, and why I think a lot of people are willing to go along with it. Do I think it's the best system? No. I'm in favor of other ones, and I'll be happy to answer those kinds of questions later.
Well, thanks very much. It's always a danger being last behind two such knowledgeable and comprehensive speakers, so I have to figure out what's left to say now that they're done. One thing I thought it might be useful, because it came up once and only once really seriously, and that was in the Bush versus Gore case, to talk a little bit about the legal mechanics of how the votes of the Electoral College are actually determined and counted. It comes out of a statute that was adopted, oddly enough, 100 years after the adoption or the signing of the Constitution, called the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which was passed as a result of one of the worst debacles in Electoral College history involving Hayes and Tilden, that eventually led to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes by a special commission on an 8-7 party line vote, one of perhaps the least legitimate presidents ever elected. And I think there's two key statutory provisions that are significant there. The first deals with how you decide whether or not a slate of electors sent by the state is the right slate of electors sent by the state. That provision says that if the state law procedures provide a definitive result following their own procedures within 6 days before the meeting of the electors to cast their vote, then those procedures are binding, or the result of those procedures are binding, and the votes of those electors have to be seated as the valid electors. That was a hugely significant provision in Bush versus Gore, because it was the state of Florida's perceived desire to meet this 6-day deadline that justified the Supreme Court's decision to call a halt to the recount rather than send the case back for proper recount. The second provision deals with the circumstance of where there's a dispute over the electors and who are the valid electors. And the key point here was a desire to avoid having disputes boil over into Congress. So they set up a series of cascading deciders, the critical point of which is only if both houses agree can Congress get to decide. So if there's a single slate of electors sent forward by the state, that single slate is binding unless both houses of Congress agree that the slate was not properly selected. If there's two or more sent, then the first choice or the first tiebreaker is whichever result the state's procedures produced if it was submitted 6 days ahead of the electors' seating. The second is if both houses of Congress agree, if neither one qualifies under the first. And then if the two houses of Congress can't agree, the governor of the state certifies the slate that was the victorious state. Now, I'm sure many of you might not have known that, but that's the final tiebreaker. A second aspect of the sort of how do you count, how do these get tallied question was alluded to by, I think, both Jonathan and Paul, and that was what happens if the electors don't vote for the person that they are supposed to vote for based on the outcome of the state's election. And right now, the states are divided roughly in half. Half of the states have nothing in their laws that binds the electors to vote for the winner of the popular vote. One of those states, by the way, is Kansas. The other approximately half of the states either require the electors to pledge to vote for the candidate whose slate they appear on, or have statutes specifically requiring them by statute to vote for the elector for whom they were committed. And some of those statutes provide different kinds of sanctions. Some impose a fine on the elector. Some purport to unseat the elector who defects and casts the faithless vote and replace them with an alternate elector. I don't really think that states can do anything once the elector is seated to recall or change the result. They might be able to fine the elector for not voting properly. I've never seen a case where that was really tried. But I don't think that they have the authority to pull back an elector because they didn't like their vote. I don't think it matters. There's no indication that it makes any difference in Kansas, for example, that we have no statute. And the answer goes back to the reality that the slate of electors consists of individuals who are pledged to vote because they are loyal to the candidate whose slate they're on. So it's not very likely that sort of diehard loyal Obama loyalists are going to get to the Electoral College and then suddenly vote for McCain or vice versa. It just isn't going to happen that way. So it happens very rarely. It hasn't happened very much, very recently, and it's never really mattered in a significant way. Sometimes, and lately, the more I watch politics, the more I wonder whether it's too bad that we aren't back in the world that the framers imagined. When you see the level of political discourse and the kinds of appeals that are being made, there's a certain wisdom reflected in their concerns about the ways in which direct popular elections might unfold. And, you know, there might be some advantage to a truly indirect representative system in which people who cared and deliberated sat down and tried to do what's best for the country. But we don't have that system. And we also don't have the other system in which we have a popular election in which one person, one vote operates to produce automatically a plurality or majority elector. So maybe we have the worst of both worlds. I don't think we'll ever go back to a world that the framers imagined if we ever had it to begin with. So maybe the question is, can we get from where we are now to some kind of direct popular election or something equivalent to it? And I'm reminded of the old joke about the stranger who asked the farmer how to get to town or how to get to a certain place, and the farmer says, "You can't get there from here." And I think that may be where we are. That however much we might like to change, I'm not sure how we can get there, because there's an awful lot of vested interests that are at stake and in play that make it difficult to change. There were references to what it takes in the way of supermajority to amend the Constitution. Just in case any of you haven't read your Constitution lately, a constitutional amendment requires first a two-thirds majority of both houses of Congress to propose the constitutional amendment, and then second, the ratification of that amendment by 3/4 of the states. And so you have to imagine, first of all, two-thirds majorities of both the House and the Senate agreeing on anything. And if you could get that, then you have to imagine a bunch of states being willing to change. And I think here an important thing to consider is that many states are pretty much solidly Democratic or Republican. And so you're really going to have to, in Kansas, you would have to ask a Republican legislature to give up the certainty of 6 Republican electoral votes in favor of a popular election which would dilute the Republican influence in Kansas. And in New York State, you would have to expect a Democratic legislature to give up all of those certain 100% Democratic electors in favor of a popular vote in which a sizable plurality would go still to a Republican elector. And you would have to ask Idaho, thanks Carl, to give up its extra votes, or Wyoming to give up its bonus value. And there's not a lot of sentiment for doing that. At least I don't think it's going to be very easy to amend the Constitution to get there. I have been intrigued by the interstate compact which has been proposed and that was mentioned by Paul. This is a system where states might agree, without changing the Electoral College, agree to have their state's electors cast their vote for whoever wins the popular election. And the way the interstate compact is worded, once you sign on by adopting it as law in your state, you don't follow it until enough other states have also enacted it so that there is a majority of the electoral votes committed to the interstate compact. So once you got 270 electoral votes or states representing that number of votes to adopt the interstate compact, then all of those states would automatically send the slate of electors committed to the candidate that won the national popular vote rather than the slate that won the popular vote in their state. And that would convert the Electoral College into ratifying the outcome of the popular vote, assuming, of course, that the electors adhered to their pledge and voted accordingly. At this point in time, last I knew, 4 states had adopted it. What did you say, Maryland?
Maryland,
Illinois, New Jersey, and Hawaii, excuse me. Other states have passed bills but not gotten gubernatorial signatures. Other states have held hearings. Only a few states have not had bills introduced. There was a bill introduced in Kansas in 2007. It was sent to committee in the House. It sat in committee in the House through both the 2007 session and the 2008 session of the legislature, and it died in committee without ever having a hearing in the state of Kansas. I think that the interstate compact is more likely to be adopted probably than a constitutional amendment because it takes much less to do it. But it's unlikely to be adopted unless there's significant public support for change. And I don't think that their calls and letters and emails were pouring into the legislature to adopt the interstate compact, and at least not by comparison to calls and letters about coal plants and other kinds of issues that were pending in the state legislature. So unless it becomes a much higher level profile issue for individuals and activists, it's unlikely that legislatures will become involved in all of this. And maybe, since we don't know exactly what would happen if it was adopted, that's not such a bad thing. One sort of, for constitutional law scholars, one sort of interesting, subtle, and uncertain question about this interstate compact is whether it would require congressional approval in order to go into effect. There's a provision in the Constitution that prohibits states from entering into treaties, and then there's another provision that prohibits states from entering into agreements or compacts with other states or with other countries absent congressional approval. So the interstate compact, at least if you read the text of the Constitution literally, would require congressional consent. But the Supreme Court never has read the text of the Constitution, at least not literally. And so there's a whole line of cases that says certain kinds of interstate compacts don't require the agreement of Congress in order to go into effect if they don't fundamentally affect the interests of other states or the national interest. I think there's a pretty good argument that the interstate compact for electoral votes does implicate national interests in the interests of other states, so that it would probably require congressional approval to go into effect. But we won't know the answer to that unless and until enough states ratify it. A final thing about the compact is it would be possible not to use a compact at all. You could just pass a statute in your state that says, this is how we're going to assign our electors. And we'll assign our electors according to the national popular vote when enough other states adopt identical legislation to make an electoral majority. Then there'd be no compact, and you would never need congressional consent. The only thing you have to worry about is other states repealing their statutes in the middle of the game, and you might not be very confident of other states doing that. So I think that's probably a good point for me to stop. I'm not even sure whether I support the compact, but I think it's an interesting and fascinating process. So thanks for your attention. I guess we'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. All right. We have one person? Do we have two this evening?
With the mics? You
Okay, well, Mike. Okay, Andrew, we'll step forward. Who has a question, please just raise your hand and take the phone and ask. Just right up front, please.
He's on his way. Everyone will be able to hear you.
Just a minute. We are recording it, and we need it on the mic for that reason.
Bill Donahue.
This gentleman here.
In relation to the third party, how does the third party, like Ross Perot, decide the election, which way it's going to go? Do they win a particular state when the state takes all of the electoral votes, or how does that work?
Well, if I understand your question, you're asking how can a third-party candidate affect in the Electoral College? Well, there's sort of two answers to that. I mean, they have to, under the present rules, win a majority in a state to get any Electoral College, any electoral votes, and that has not happened often. I mean, Perot did not get any electoral votes, even though he got 19% of the votes in 1992.
Yeah, 20 million votes in 0 states.
Yeah. On the other hand, George Wallace did get 47 or 8 electoral votes because his support was concentrated in the Deep South, and therefore he was able to win, I believe, 5 states and about 48 electoral votes. Now, had that been sufficient to make Nixon not get a majority in the Electoral College, it would have been deadlocked. The Electoral College would have been indecisive. It would have gone to the House of Representatives. We would have had this House contingency election. The way that system works is every state gets 1 vote. And so their congressional delegation has to, if they're a majority of Democrats, they'll cast that vote for the Democratic Party. If they're a majority of Republicans, they'll cast it for the Republican Party. If they're tied, like in Kansas, they presumably will not vote at all. Okay? But there has to be 25 plus 1, 26 states whose delegations in the House of Representatives support a particular candidate. Right now, the Democrats have majority of 27. In 1968, I'm not sure how that went, but it's likely that there wasn't a majority for any particular candidate, in which case a George Wallace could have tried to broker something. He could have gone to Nixon and said, if you follow, our agenda, we'll throw our electoral votes to you.
Or give me the right cabinet post.
Or give me the right cabinet votes, or any kind of shenanigans you can imagine.
Did you have a comment on that, Rick?
Well, the second way that you can influence the Electoral College as a third-party candidate is by influencing the outcome in a state. There are a lot of people who think Ralph Nader influenced the outcome in Florida, for example, in favor, and that if those votes would have otherwise gone to Gore, and then the outcome would have been in favor of Gore, and then the outcome of the election would have been in favor of Gore.
And Ross Perot for Bill Clinton in 1992.
That Clinton won states because Perot took votes away from Bush Sr.
I just want to add, if you're interested, we had a great program at the Dole Institute last October before the candidates emerged from their respective primaries, and it's on our website, and it really shows you some experts being very skeptical that either political party, both of which are so vested in our current system, would ever want to give up what we have now.
Okay, question. Anyone on this side? All right. Would you go to the person second row, please?
Now, you all said several times you don't think anything will change. The political consultants last week, I think Struther said, if we have an election that goes in favor of one party like 2000, and then in this election, if it went the other way in favor of Obama, with McCain getting the popular vote, etc., there might be momentum for change. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there would be more momentum for change. Whether it's enough to get over the mountain is another question. People, I think, often lose interest in particular issues fairly quickly. There was a lot of momentum against the war in Iraq a year ago. There doesn't seem to be the same degree of momentum. And so I think it would be more likely to do something if there's more than one instance of it in people's personal knowledge and memory. The more it happens, the more likely people are to get upset.
I thought it was profound what Paul said in his remarks about how quickly people's eyes got taken off the Electoral College ball in 2000 and got thinking about other things like Katherine Harris, like the Chads. And I also remember how much pressure was on Vice President Gore to concede. People who I thought would be saying, fight on, Al, were saying, for the good of the country, we have to bind up our wounds. And I think there's tremendous pressure to put these things behind us. So I'm even dubious if the scenario you suggested happened, that there would be change. Now, that said, I hope more people come on to my side, and I'd love to have that bill reintroduced in Kansas, Representative Ballard maybe, about the interstate compact.
And we can count on you for a blitz of emails to the
Sure,
legislature.
okay, I'll be one of those cranks with the email.
Well, I'll tell you what he said before, someone did introduce it. It went to a committee, and it just stayed there for 2 years. What that really said is no one wanted to touch it. Or they were afraid people were willing to touch it. All right? Question? Side right there, please. And we'll come on this side after that, please.
It was mentioned that Nebraska and Maine used the district plan.
Yes.
What would have to happen for a state to switch to that plan?
The Constitution specifies that state legislatures can choose whatever way they wish. This is not a federal regulation of how states run things, so states can do what they want. The Kansas legislature can adopt it if they want. Now, as Richard mentioned, it's highly unlikely that in Kansas, the Republicans who control the legislature would be at all interested in the district plan, because why would they want a system which they already have locked up 6? Why would they put 2 in jeopardy? Right. And that's similar kind of calculus in almost all states. So, and there are some reasons why the district plan has certain limitations as well. I happen to think it would be an improvement in many states. I think it would bring some greater involvement of Kansas, and perhaps increased voter turnout in districts like our district, where we think, we could actually deliver a vote for Obama. I think there are benefits to it, but they're probably not overwhelming enough to, without a great deal of popular support for it for the legislature.
Jonathan?
I think I agree with Paul that it would be an improvement, but the only times I ever see it be proposed in real life are as kind of a little political trick. There's always a guy in California with a lot of money behind him trying to get all the petition signatures to get it on the ballot in California to allocate California's electors proportionally, and that would just be a terrible thing if you're a Democrat. That's 55 electoral votes or 54 electoral votes that are in the bank almost, and they're trying to game the system that way. Okay.
Any comments, Rick? You're okay.
Well, I mean, it just goes back to the point that maybe a good analogy is I like sports analogy. If you're in the middle of a football game, it's a bad time to try to get the teams to agree on how to change the rules, because the team that's winning kind of likes the rules the way they are. And the people who are being involved in changing these rules are the people who are playing the game, and they're in the middle of the game. And so the sort of notion that you're going to get widespread agreement among the team that's winning and the team that's losing about how to change the rules of the game is, I think, pretty unlikely. I guess that's my concern.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. All right. Over here, since we had 2 on this side, and I'm back over here. Go ahead.
John, you talked about the world that's gone forever, that world of deference that the framers thought that they were working in, and we're in a much different world. But wouldn't it be possible to say that because most Americans aren't really that agitated by the idea that the election for president has this indirection, that we're closer to that spirit of sort of mature deliberation? People don't worry about something like this because they just assume that however it comes about, the most legitimate choice is made.
I completely agree that most Americans do not see a problem with the current situation. Although if you poll, is the Electoral College a good thing? If you kind of tell them about it, it seems to go the other way. I don't know. I'll throw that question back to you guys in the audience. Does our electoral system always give us the best president, or does it give us what we deserve in some ironic way? I'm not sure I answered your question, Carl, but yeah, please. No, yeah.
Just wait for the mic. Just 1 second, please. Go ahead.
Might be people would look at the results of direct elections in their own states for governor, senator, member of Congress and say, what, this produces something better? I mean, it's pretty hard to offer the idea that direct elections always produce the best candidate if that's your proposal for replacing the Electoral College.
Well, I think you can take it a step further. I mean, if you take a look, one possible interpretation of people's indifference is mature acceptance that the best person won. Another possibility is that most people are so frustrated and disappointed that they don't think it matters. That it's choices between two bad candidates, and no matter which candidate wins, the system is going to continue to be fought out at an incredibly degraded level in which people are more interested in partisan gain than national interest. And I think the winner of the national election is usually none of the above. If you count everybody who stays away and doesn't vote as voting against the candidates that are available, they get more than either of the candidates do. So another possibility is people don't get exercised about it because the average person doesn't see the difference as being that significant. And of course you have the rabid bloggers, left and right going at each other that care deeply, but the average person, I don't know they see that much difference.
Great, thank you. Want to take this person, please, sir?
Since it was understood by the Founding Fathers that constitutional republics tend to establish long-term stable governments, whereas popular democracies tend to break down fairly quickly into tyranny of various types of tyranny, what's changed? You advocate popular democracy, but what's changed?
Okay, thank you.
Well, everything has changed. Indeed, the Constitution doesn't talk about democracy. It was presumed that we were forming a republic, a Republican government, which would, in fact, diminish popular participation and responsiveness to public preferences. But the 19th century was a century of great democratization. And the establishment of political parties, the changes in how state legislatures, in fact, established elections for the presidency. They did go to having popular elections in the state rather than have themselves appoint electors. There just were a lot. There's a whole different ethos here. John said there was an ethos of elite deference, which no longer exists. And we live in a world in which, for better or worse, people believe that democracy involving, essentially widespread participation, equality among citizens, and those sort of norms ought to be exhibited in the electoral system, if not in government in a larger sense. So I just think there are huge cultural changes.
I would also add that direct popular election of the president doesn't convert you from a republic to a democracy. The president is the commander-in-chief and the head of the executive branch, but we still have a representative legislature. That's a Republican institution. If you were going to have a democracy, you would have people voting on every statute. And, maybe that's what happens in California with their, ballot initiatives. And that doesn't produce very good results for California, to be quite honest. And then conversely, the way the Electoral College operates now is nothing like a republic. It's not a system in which you are electing representatives who deliberate on your behalf and use their superior wisdom. It's a system in which the popular vote is translated, but not in a direct one-to-one kind of way.
I just very briefly would add, while people in the 18th century really cared about what Richard said, I don't see Australia and South Korea and Japan kind of collapsing into tyranny because they have direct election of their leaders.
Or England.
Yeah, or God bless England.
Okay. Other question? Okay, there. And we'll take the last one over here. Oh, well, I saw your hand. Okay.
So, is it me?
Go ahead, Ty.
Okay.
We'll get to this one.
I just wondered what you thought of this. One of the critiques of the Electoral College now is that it forces candidates to focus their resources where the battleground states where there's a lot of electors and there's a chance for them to win. If we pass, set aside all reality. If we pass, say, like 2 constitutional amendments, one that limited campaign spending to a reasonable amount and another that abolished the Electoral College, do you think that would force the candidates to focus their resources in regions or states where it's close, say within 10 points? I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because you guys are really smart.
I don't think it would make much difference at all. I think the candidates are always going to go where the most undecided voters are, and just on pure population grounds, they'll still be spending most of their time in the big metropolitan areas, and they won't be in Lawrence, Kansas.
I just think it would be very unlikely for those things to happen, but I like the question. Wow. I have no answer.
Well, I think it would be, I'm not a big fan of unlimited spending and what it has produced. But I think you have to watch out for the cure being worse than the disease. And I'm not sure that you improve the political process by eliminating the means through which candidates communicate and try to get out their message. I certainly wish that the television ads and campaign activities actually focused on issues and that we were engaged in intelligent discussions about the critical issues facing the country. But I think it's as much a product of how voters vote, that's the way our discourse works, and the things that move voters to vote, and that if voters rejected the kind of campaign discourse that we have, then the discourse would change. But the reality of it is the politics of, personal destruction is what works, and candidates who want to get elected use it. So I don't really see much changing, partly for the reasons that Paul said, but also partly because candidates want to win, and they get advisors who tell them how to do it, and they follow what the advisors say.
Okay, the person right next to you.
Do you guys feel that the more direct election would, you said earlier that the Electoral College caused the average person not necessarily to care as much about it because it was complicated for whatever reason. Do you think a direct election would cause more people to want to go out and vote because their vote legitimately mattered because it's 1 for 1? Do you think that maybe that'd make a difference and get the voter turnout in America up?
I do. I think it's if you're a Democrat in Kansas who really wants Barack Obama to be president, but there's a very good reason to say, why don't you, read a book instead of going to vote, because it's not going to happen.
Well, that certainly is a perspective that
Yeah.
is we all sort of took into the project I was involved in, and the literature, however, did not confirm that. It basically said that there wasn't, essentially because we are also voting for Barbara and other people at the same time. We still have other elections going on. That means that we're not, just focused on the competitiveness of that particular election. So there isn't a sizable effect that we can see. If I could just end with one comment, a really depressing comment to leave.
Oh, please now.
Don't go there.
No, go ahead.
I'd like to just say that, what is it that would get Americans to care about the Electoral College? And if I think about things, I think that having a House contingency election would be disastrous. But I would even go beyond the disaster that John talked about. We won't in this election, but in another election, we could end up with no candidate being able to get a majority of the state delegations. There are, at present, only 2 states that are tied in their delegations, but it's likely that's an unlikely sort of scenario. We can easily see, say, 23 Republican, 23 Democrat, and 4 undecided states, and they, in our polarized environment, could simply not resolve the issue. And there is no mechanism. You can't just say, well, the Supreme Court, please step in. There is no provision for dealing with the failure of the House contingency. So I believe that no matter what happens, we ought to be a little bit foresighted and try to fix that, but that does require a constitutional amendment. So if we're going to fix the Constitution, why put a Band-Aid over it? Let's get it right.
That's a great point.
Let me go back to the question on getting people to vote. I've always been kind of fascinated by the idea that your vote makes a difference. Because there are, how many people voted in the last election?
Over
105 million.
So how is your vote going to make a difference in the outcome of an election, whether we have a direct popular election or an electoral college? Ultimately, one person's vote doesn't ever swing any but the very small percentage of elections where there's only a few people voting. Even in the closest election that anybody can ever remember, when we were doing the recounts in Florida trying to figure out whether it was Bush or Gore, the ultimate outcome was thousands of votes difference between Bush and Gore in Florida. I don't remember the exact number. So a rational, this is public choice theory for those of you aficionados, so, a rational person would not take the time to go vote on the basis of the actual impact of that person's vote, because the actual impact of the vote is so small it has absolutely no value. The reason why you go vote is because the participation in the electoral process matters to you, not because you're actually going to influence the outcome of the election. It matters to some people and it doesn't matter to others, and the people that it doesn't matter to don't vote. Or that it doesn't matter enough to don't vote. So I think if you want to get more people to participate, then it goes down to sort of starting when you're really young, bringing up people who care about participating in the political process. That's how you're going to get people to participate.
Okay, we're going to end with this last question in front. What happened to a mic?
I thought your last question was the last question.
Oh, well, I
You
promise.
can add, we'll repeat the question.
I promise
if you
that
want
I
to ask
recorded it. Charlie, that will be yours. Oh, they're coming to Mike. Thank you. I did say that, and then I changed it right there. Sorry. Thank you very much. Charlie, you have the last one. Make it a good one.
should we assume then that if there is a quote best way of electing our leaders, that's probably not a procedure we're going to see here. It's really going to boil down more to us as to which flawed procedure we want to use. And if there is a quote best way of electing our leaders, does any other country do it that way? And if they do, how can they pull it off and we can't?
You misunderstood my comments if you thought I said by getting it right we have to have the best way. There is no best way. The only best way is whatever each society agrees is, given the culture and values of that society, maximizes their particular values according to, And so if we favor certain things like having votes count equally and having sincere voters and having a simple election and those sort of things, then if that's our values, we should select a different system, probably the popular plurality system. But if we have other values, if we like our two-party system and we think it maximizes legitimacy and it's a good, safe solution because we aren't tinkering with unknown consequences, then we should choose that. But there isn't a right system. But what I object to is having the decision being made 220 years ago and not being able to revise that decision in light of our contemporary understandings.
I guess I would say we have a different system than most every other country does in terms of how we elect our leaders. Most other countries, democratic countries, have a parliamentary system that allows proportional representation within their parliaments or other legislative bodies, and then the leader of their government is elected by the majority of that body. This allows third parties, fourth parties to be formed, and it requires some coalition governance in order to accomplish it. I think that system gives more people the feeling like they have the ability to vote for somebody that can represent them, and it promotes voter turnout. I think if we had a system like that, it's hard to imagine exactly what it would look like, but if you try to imagine the United States under a parliamentary system, we'd have a left party, a right party, and a center party. And the center party would be the power broker, and our government would tend to be much more centrist. Now we have two parties which in their primaries are controlled by the far left and the far right of their parties. And then after electing the far left and the far right of their parties, they come battle for the center, who don't really have anybody who's really centrist to vote for anymore. So, I mean, I think if you really wanted to start thinking about what's the best system, you might think about scrapping presidential system altogether and move over to a parliamentary system. There are disadvantages with those systems as well. They tend to be less stable than ours. But anyway.
It's a good question. I mean, I always get quotes wrong when I don't have them in front of me. But didn't Churchill say democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others? Or was he talking about capitalism? Anyway, it's a pretty good line anyway.
I thought it was George Bernard Shaw.
Okay, maybe it was George Bernard Shaw.
I thank you. And I hope, that you learned a lot this evening, that it challenged you to think about what this system is. And if we should change it, what do we go to? When we were talking with Rick Levy initially about this, we had to think of these ideas. And he said, well, the Electoral College. Well, it fit with what we wanted to do. And after we developed the POTUS 44 series, it really did come together. So I think for you to have the opportunity to listen and participate and ask questions about the Electoral College, that you probably were shocked at some of the things you found out, and other things you probably are just outright mad, But I think when you look at it, that's what our system is. And I hope you got a better understanding of it. It was exciting for me to hear it. And I would just, when we talk about our programs, one of the things that I'm most proud of, we have faculty members on this campus that go anywhere and everywhere to speak. And yet, when they're at home, they're generous with their time, and they will come and share it with us in the community as well. And I think for that, we owe them a big hand.